Techno Barbarian here. Welcome back. If you're new to my channel, I convert box trucks into tiny homes, and today we're continuing on with my first client build with the wiring and electrical. By the end of this video, I hope to give you an understanding of my strategy for wiring box trucks and why I think it's the best. The first step in any successful wiring job is going to be planning. It's true what they say, if you fail to plan, you plan to fail. The difficulty and the amount of planning required is really dependent on the level of the finished product that you want to see in your box truck. If you're okay with having open conduit and wires running everywhere and components that are visible, you can skimp a little bit on the planning because you can always modify that since your cables and wiring will be easily accessible. They're not hidden behind wall panels. As you're all aware, I like to put a little more attention to detail in my builds. I like to build these out to feel like a home where there are no components visible, there's no open conduits, wires running everywhere, no visual indications that you're in a vehicle or an RV or something that has a DIY feel to it. So that means I have to have all my wire runs in before the wall panels go on. And once the wall panels are on, there's really no way for me to modify those wire runs after the fact. So it's very important to know exactly what you want to put in the truck, what you're going to need, that's going to need electricity, and where it's going to go. So I've already got everything mapped out here in this truck. I actually took a magic marker and ran the lines between where I'm going to have my inverter all the way to each component, marked out where each one is 12 volt or 120 volt, which gives me an idea of where I need to actually cut my wire runs. Now, when I say cut, it's time to address what you're actually seeing in the video here. I'm actually running the wire through a line that I put in the wall, in the insulation, and through the framing with a router. I'm actually cutting a channel into the insulation board and the framing that's about as thick as the wire itself. Once done, that wire actually sits snugly in that routed channel, kind of holds itself in place there, which allows me to put all the wiring in place before I put the wall panels on. I think the key component to this is using a flat cable, which in this case is a 3-conductor standard ground neutral hot cable arrangement, but simply in a flat rather than a round wire. It's possible to do this with a round wire as well, but it probably wouldn't work as well. You just have to cut a bit of a smaller channel with the router. So step 2 is once you have everything mapped in your truck, go ahead and cut those lines with, in this case, a router, and then run those wires. Of course, keeping in mind the appropriate wire sizing, so most of the time you're going to have either 14, 12, or 10 gauge wire. 10 gauge is a little bit rare, mostly just for water heaters or high amperage units. 12 gauge wire for any kind of GFCI 20 amp outlets, and 14 gauge for your standard 15 amp home outlets. And when it comes to 12 volt wiring, you'll probably find yourself using a lot of 14 or 12 gauge. And again, this is all part of the planning process. You got to make sure and go through, what the amperage loads are going to be for each of your individual components and make sure to use the appropriate size wiring. I would also say that using stranded wire is going to be best practice in any kind of moving vehicle for various reasons, but primarily the fact that it is meant to be a little more flexible, move around, similar to an extension cable, whereas a solid copper wire is going to be a little more rigid, and over time as it bends and flexes and vibrates, there's a possibility that it could be breaking and need replacement. Actually, one benefit of wiring a box truck like this rather than wiring something like a van where you have open cavities you're putting wiring through is the fact that that wire, once it's actually in that insulation channel, it's not going to move at all ever. So there really won't be any kind of vibration on that, and it's technically possible, I would say, to use solid copper wire in these situations, but I would consider that to be skimping. Also consider the fact that stranded wire is generally what you're going to find in marine grade applications. It's also coming in tinned copper format, which means that it's going to be a little more resistant to corrosion and water in case any kind of moisture gets in there. So I always use marine grade components in my trucks, and that does include stranded tinned copper wire. So step 3 is to use appropriately sized high quality wiring. Moving on, I'd say step 4 is going to be to use special components to terminate your circuits, but also connect circuits together or connect multiple components in a singular circuit together. So what am I talking about here? Well, primarily I'm talking about using a surface mount junction box rather than a standard residential junction box. I'm using a Leviton surface mount junction box here because this allows me to actually fasten the box to the wall itself rather than having to rely on a stud, which is what traditional junction boxes will make you do. Now, we don't have studs in a lot of these locations, which means I don't have anything other than foam to screw it into, and obviously foam is not going to hold these junction boxes in place. Another benefit of this box is that it's a 2-in-1 system, which allows me to attach the back plate to the wall first and then attach the box to it, which gives you a little more flexibility during the install process. Speaking of connecting wires together for multiple components or complex circuits, including switches, let me introduce you to the wonderful world of lever nuts. Lever nuts, as opposed to wire nuts, are a vastly superior method for connecting multiple wires together and creating longer and more complex circuits. Lever nuts are essentially tiny clamps that hold wires together, and there's no amount of vibration that will loosen the wire from the grip of a lever nut. Though totally fine for residential applications, a wire nut is essentially useless for a moving vehicle because the vibration will definitely over time loosen it to some degree, giving you either a weak connection or a totally broken connection that needs to be modified or maintained down the line. So I highly recommend getting an assortment of different lever nut sizes to accommodate all of the different sizes of wiring that you'll be using in your build. Lever nuts are also a great way to extend the length of a wire that you cut too short. So you can always just connect another length of wire into a lever nut to extend that existing wire. I've had to extend wire runs myself in the past after cutting them a little too short, and I can say for sure that the lever nut is the best and easiest way to do that. The final point I'd probably provide to you for best practices when wiring a box truck would be to consider the length of your wire runs and try to be as efficient as possible with your wire runs. Now, there are multiple reasons for this. Number one being the cost. Of course, wire is going to be one of the most expensive components that you'll buy for your truck, especially if you do have a lot of components you're going to be powering. Secondly, using long wire runs could actually increase the size of the wire that you need to use, thereby further increasing your costs even more. Any electrical current flowing through a conductor is going to experience what's called a voltage drop. Now, I'm not an electrician by any means, but I can explain this fairly simply as the simple fact that electricity will diminish over long lengths of conductor. So I highly recommend referencing voltage drop charts to make sure that you're using the appropriate size wire gauge for the length of the wire run that you're using. So those are my tips on best practices for wiring your box truck. If you guys have anything that I left out, leave them in the comments down below. Don't forget, you guys can always reference my previous videos on the wiring and electrical systems, but I will be going over all components of the electrical systems again in terms of what I've learned, what I'm doing differently. Everything from the solar panels to the solar charge controller and inverter to the batteries and the battery management systems. I'll be going over all of those in later videos, so make sure you stay tuned if you want to get details on them. And as always, feel free to go join my private community at technobarbarian.locals.com. That's our community of van builders over there. You get access to direct message me with a small monthly subscription. You can ask me any questions about your personal build, questions about electrical, or really anything at all. Thanks to all my supporters over there for your continued support. And we'll see you guys on the next one.